We're now up to the Mishnah Daf Pei Hey. Ein Meviim, we don't bring grains. Lomi Beis Hazvolim, right? Zevel is fertilizer, and we don't bring grains from a fertilized field. A field that has to be fertilized is not acceptable as a source of grain, neither for the Omer nor for the Shtel Lechem, because it may not have been sufficiently fertilized, and its produce will then be inferior. Below Beis Hashlochim, or a field that's irrigated, so the ground is so arid that it requires irrigation. Such fields will yield slender fruits. I guess slender here doesn't mean, a positive thing. Velomi Beis Ha'ilon, a field of trees. Why? And I think there are a number of different explanations for this, but basically grain that has been grown between trees of inferior, the trees siphon off the nutrients in the ground and weaken the seeds. Alternatively, the shade of the trees hinders the grain's growth and therefore shouldn't be used neither for Omer or Shtel Lechem. Heavy, however, B'di'evet, if he brought from any of these fields kosher, then the carbon is kosher after the fact. Only in Bikurim, according to Rabbi Yochanan, and according to Ula before, do we say that inferior quality is disqualified. And that's in Bikurim, but not in Menachos. Now, the next part of the Mishnah and the Gemara on this Mishnah requires a great deal of knowledge in agriculture. And as you can imagine, my knowledge in agriculture is very limited. Anyway, the Mishnah says the following. Keitzaru osa, if you want to produce superior grains, what should you do? What's the secret? Nora. Nora means to plow. And after you plow, sometimes you sow the ground, and sometimes you leave it open, exposed. That's called near, in order for the rains and the nutrients to soak up into the ground, and then you'll wait a certain period of time, and then you'll sow. So therefore, on the first year, Nora, Shana Rishona Nora, leave it near, leave it open. On the first year of whatever cycle we'll see, after you do the plowing, don't plant. And that gives the ground a full year to regenerate itself and to generate nutrients. And then eventually, when we sow, we'll get a superior crop. And that's B'Shana Shniya Zora. So the following year, the second year, you plant, you sow. He says if he plows the field a second time before he sows it, then the field is actually plowed twice. He says here that the verb near appears in Yirmiyahu, Perek Daled, Hosea, Perek Yud, where it connotes plowing in the summer to kill the roots of the grasses, so the ground will not grow thorns when it's sown in the winter. So we plow it in the summer and sow it in the winter. So the first year he plows without sowing. So I guess if I understand correctly, he's saying that the plowing will kill the roots of the grasses. So that was in the summer of the first year. He doesn't plant in the winter that follows the summer. Then it says, Ubishana Shnia Zora, in the second year he sows, and I'm going to assume now that the second year sowing is going to be way after the summer, into the winter, and when? Kodem LePesach Shivim Yom. So on the second year, he's sowing 70 days before Pesach. Now, this has to do with the fact that the most successful and high quality produce depends upon the sun, the sunlight. And if he plants it before Pesach, 2 1/3 months, then the sun comes out around Pesach time, and it's sufficiently strong to stimulate the desired growth. Now, this is true for the barley of the Omer, which is brought on Pesach. The Rambam, this is a very important Rambam, says that this requirement or recommendation applies to all Menachos, not just to the Minchas HaOmer. The Mishnah continues and says, "V'hu oses solis meruba." If you follow this procedure, then you'll produce abundant fine flour. And Ketzad Bodek, how does the Gizbar, who's in charge of supervising on behalf of the Beis Hamikdash, how does he check out and determine that the sifting was sufficient? And therefore he has soles meruba. Hagizbar machnis yodol litochan. Again, the question is whether he first oils his hands or not. But right now we're going to assume he doesn't even put oil on his hands. And he digs his hands into the flour. And how does he examine whether or not it's sufficiently sifted? Is Allah of if dust, the dust of the flour comes up in his hands, then it's not ready. Psula. Apparently, it hasn't been sifted sufficiently. Ad sheyinapenu, and therefore he has to sift it again. Period. People customarily purchase flour for their menachos from the gizbar, just as they purchased an esachim from the gizbar. But homemade flour could be used as long as it was sufficiently fine flour. Mishnah concludes, "V'misliya psula." We're going to have a whole discussion about this. If the flour became wormy, it is invalid. Now, it doesn't mean it was fully ridden with worms, but a majority was wormy. Whatever that means, majority, we're going to have to get into that. Okay, the Gemara says the following. Ketzad Osa, what should he do in order to produce the high quality crop? Nara Shonash Rishona, right? He only does plowing on the first year, and he doesn't plant it. In the second year, he's going to plant it 70 days before Pesach. Iboilahu. Hechi Omar. What did the Mishnah say that he ought to do? Nora Shana Rishona, Ushnia Nora Vizora, meaning that we need a second round of plowing in the second year. The first plowing is not sufficient. So in the summer of the second year, he repeats what he did in the summer of the previous year, the first year, and he plows his field. Oh, Dilma, the second possibility in the Gemara is that although he plowed it in the first year, there's no need to plow it again in the second year, but rather Shnia Zora below Zora. All he has to do is plant, and he doesn't have to plow it. Toshma, we'll have an answer from the following price. So Omer Rab Yossi, Af Chite Karzayim, Ukfar Achim, again, different places. And now the big question is the next word, ilmole. Okay. Ilmole smuchos Yerushalayim. Ilmole that ends with an aleph means if only, whereas ilmole that ends with a yud is going to be if not for. So ilmole, if only they were smuchos Yerushalayim. In other words, Rabbi Yossi is saying that these chitim from these places, which are unfortunately too far from Yerushalayim to bring for the Omer of the Shtei Lechem, but they're of very superior quality, and had there been a proximity to Yerushalayim, then that would be an excellent choice to bring the crops from those two areas for the Omer on Pesach and the Shtei Lechem on Shavuos. And why don't we take them if they're such superior quality? And we're going to assume now that mudramos from the Lashon of Darom, they're in the south part of Eretz Yisrael. There, the winter sun remains in the southern sky most of the day. Tosas, however, has a manuscript Rashi, and he quotes, in the south of Yerushalayim. These are fields on the southern slopes on any side of the city of Yerushalayim. So again, the northern slopes don't receive light or sunlight, and the southern slopes, which are called what's it called again? Mudromos, they receive more sunlight. Haminunaros lekach. And now we get back to that word near, which means to plow. Shebahem chamazorachas umehen chamashokas. The sun shines on the crops until it sets. And during the winter, the sun rises in the southeast. Okay, we know that the sun rises in the east, but we have to emphasize the southeast, and remains, again, this only in the wintertime, in the southern sky most of the day until it sets in the southwest. Thus, crops planted on the southern slopes become totally ripened. Now we get to the longer days. The sun rises further away from the south and moves towards the south only later in the morning. The Brisa is thus stating that although the fields of Chite Karzayim and Kfar Achim have southern exposures and would be cultivated for the sake of the Omer, their barley cannot be used for the mitzvah since these two locations are not close to Yerushalayim. Ketzad Oser, the Brisa continues, and now we'll have a repeat of what we learned in the Mishnah. Nora Shana Rishona, Ushnia choresh v'shona. So here it says explicitly that once again in the summer of the second year he repeats his plowing a second time around. V'zora kodem lepesach shloshim yom, as we learned in the Mishnah, k'zei shtei smucha lechama, so that the growing period will be close to the sun at its greatest strength, which is right before Pesach. As the spring approaches, the sun is drawn into an increasingly northern path across the daytime sky and continuously strengthens. Hence, planting is not performed at the beginning of the winter season, but rather 70 days before Pesach, for the sun is not so strong at that time. But if you wait until 70 days before Pesach and plant it then, the sprouting crops will have the advantage of a stronger sun. Planting at the beginning of the winter would take fuller advantage of the sun being in the southern sky most of the day. Nevertheless, waiting until 70 days before Pesach allows the crops to benefit from the strengthening sun. V'ose kona zeres v'shiboles zartayim. Again, there's a lot of agriculture here. The field is going to produce a stalk the size of a zeres and an ear the size of two zereses. When the inedible stalk will grow to a zeres in height, the ear containing the kernels will be twice that size, 2 zerasos high. A zeres is half of an amma. The kotzer uma'amar v'dosh, these are all the various malachas that you do until finally you can harvest your crops. Zore, borer, tochem, meraken. Umevi eitzel gizbar. Now he makes flour after he harvests the crop. And not only did he harvest the crop, but he gathered them together, he threshes them, he winnows them, he selects from the good from the bad, he grinds them, he softens them, he sifts it. Hagizbar, as we saw in the Mishnah, machnes yodol letocha, im also ba'avak, he knows that it's not yet ready. Omer lo, chazor v'napeo sashnia, go a second round and sift it. Mishum Rabbi Nosson Omru Gizbar Sach Yodo V'Shemet. Remember, I said there's a possibility that maybe before the Gizbar puts his hand into the solas, he should first dip it in oil. That's the Shita Rabbi Nosson. Umachnis Litocha. Then he inserts his hand into the flour. Achemala Kol Avoka. And this is going to take away all the dust that has to be removed in order to refine the flour. He says the dust, which is the powdery part of the flour, will adhere more readily to the oil than to the thicker particle. Ktani miyas choresh v'shona. Right? In any event, we see from the Brisa, which contradicts our Mishnah, that he does a plowing in the second year to repeat the original plowing of the first year. Our Mishnah would have to be read as saying Nora Rishona Ushnia. So again, let's just go over the suffix. Yiboilahu. Nora Shana Shnio Dilma, Nora Shana Rishono, Shnia Zora below Nora. And now what conclusion are we coming to? Chorish Rishona. That he repeats the plowing in the second year. And the Gemara says, no, I don't like your logic, your proof. Why? Because L'Tamech Masnisin Lok Tani Shona. Meaning, how can you possibly assume that both the Mishnah and the Brisa are saying the same thing, and you repeat the plowing in the second year? The Mishnah says nothing about repeating the plowing in the second year.